In 2021, I created this small wildlife pond in my garden. And with the help of a trail camera, I soon discovered that it had become a hotspot for the local wildlife. A variety of birds, insects, mammals, and amphibians all use this pond on a daily basis. But it wasn't until 2022, during a heat wave, that I saw just how much the local wildlife depended on this water source. When my trail camera captured not one, but 3 foxes drinking from the pond. Therefore, I decided to build a much larger pond with the hope that it may help even more wildlife. So, on the 26th of July 2022, during the heatwave, I began digging out my new pond. I knew where I wanted to position the pond and knew how I wanted it to look, based on a few key features. Shallow, natural edges with a deeper reservoir in the middle, which will enable me to photograph birds or even mammals drinking and bathing in the pond, whilst maintaining a steady water supply throughout the year. This was especially important to me, as my smaller pond had previously run the risk of drying out in extreme heat. As my garden is mostly on a slope, I used a spirit level to ensure that all sides of the pond matched, which is important in determining the water level for the shallower edges. I used my spade to shape the bank of the pond and raked away any loose stones. I knew then that I would continue to develop the pond over time, and with that in mind, it was just a matter of pushing on with it. This was my first time building such a large pond, so I'm clearly not an expert and definitely made a few mistakes along the way, but at the end of the day, it was all part of the fun and learning as I was going along. I continued to rake away any loose stones, which I then sieved from the soil and collected in a bucket. I'll be using the smooth stones from this bucket later on. Once I was happy with the shape of the pond, I placed some old carpet down on top of the soil. This will act as an underlay for the pond liner to protect it from any sharp stones for when I eventually fill it with water. That night, I was pleased to see the local fox had already taken an interest in my work, and given it the overall approval. Just a few days later, and the pond liner that I had ordered finally arrived, so that evening I set about placing it in the pond. The liner proved to be quite difficult to place by myself, so I used a few stones and pieces of wood to hold it in place. Then I tried my best to remove as many of the creases as I could, but ultimately I knew that I would be placing soil on top of the liner for a more natural look, so I wasn't too worried. Okay, so a quick update on the pond. I got the liner in last night. I've been trying to smooth it out and everything, but I don't know how well that's going to work. Just trying my best, and I've already started putting some sand and soil down just to cover it, just lightly cover it. I know I won't cover like the sheer sides as they're too steep, but I was kind of limited with what I could do. So I've started putting in some stones, and I might actually leave some of the wood that I've got around the edges just to kind of like fill it out, give it that sort of natural look. And then I'm actually going to start filling it before I put any more soil or sand in, but I might start working around the edge. I'm sorry if you can hear the building work behind me. Might start covering in the edge of the lining, getting ready to cut it and trim it and do all the bits that I need to do just to like hide it before I then start putting the plants in. But yeah, hopefully going to start putting water in soon, so excited. Now it's time to uncover a secret. When filling my pond, I wanted to avoid using tap water and instead only use natural rainwater. However, the heatwave had continued and rain wasn't expected for another month. Thankfully, my garden has a large hidden well that only collects fresh rainwater. The problem is just getting it out. So I bought this water pump and carefully lowered it down. I attached a hose that was long enough to reach the pond and began to wait for it to fill. Unfortunately, there was still only enough water to half fill the pond, so instead, I would just have to wait for more rain. One month later, and this is how it looked. It was still only half full, but I had been busy clearing the soil around the edges. I added a few of the stones and even a couple of pond plants. I was happy to see that the wildlife had already started using the pond, including, to my surprise, a heron. Sadly, I didn't have any footage of this, but I couldn't help notice the large footprints left in the soil, along with a few of those of the local fox. A few frogs had already begun to call the pond home, in an attempt to avoid the heat. With summer coming to a close, I wanted to start adding a few more plants, both in and around the pond, in the hope of them becoming more established, ready for next year. These purple toadflax grow like a weed in my garden, but their tall flowery stems are great for attracting pollinators. I also planted lots of yellow iris, which will grow to form a kind of reed bed. Their foliage will provide shelter for various insects and amphibians, whilst I'm hoping their root system will help keep the soil along the edges of the pond in place. Most of these plants will flower the following year, and with that they will also self-seed to help really fill out the pond. At this point, I was pleased with how the pond was taking shape. I knew it still needed work, but in time, these plants will grow and eventually it will all come together. A new visitor to the garden signified that winter was just around the corner. This particular field fare became a resident over the winter months and was very partial to any leftover apples. The bird feeders had lots of action too, attracting a variety of birds such as this small blue tit and flock of long-tailed tits. I was, however, particularly pleased to see some goldfinches feeding on the seed heads of teasels, which I had planted earlier in the year, specifically in the hopes of attracting more goldfinches to my garden. Finally, with a flurry of snow, winter had arrived, and things started to quieten down around the pond. The water remained completely frozen for several weeks in both ponds. Unsurprisingly, the wildlife mostly disappeared from around the pond, and instead, I watched numerous blackbirds fighting over the remaining apples on the ground. Despite having snow on the ground, the ice eventually began to melt, and it wasn't long before the local wildlife started to use it again. By far, one of the most frequent visitors to the pond, the common blackbird. I would often see them hopping around on the trail camera, and I was even able to film one bathing in the ice-cold waters. I installed this solar-powered bird box camera to encourage more nesting birds, and it wasn't long before I had my first visitor, a great tit. Hopefully, we'll be seeing more of them in the future. I was always pleased to see the fox return at night. Most of the time, they would either pass by the pond or even stop to have a drink. and check out the trail camera. Before long, spring was on its way, and it was finally time for me to start making a few changes around the pond. With new species already beginning to appear and summer quickly approaching, I was excited to see the results of all my hard work in the months ahead, and just how much of an impact this would have on the local wildlife.